Hi there, you're listening to No Virtue with Will Wilkinson, a podcast from the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. I'm Will Wilkinson, the Vice President for Policy at the Niskanen Center, and today I'm talking to Jacob Levy. Today I'm talking to Jacob Levy. Sorry, Jacob. I'll just do that bit again then.
Yeah.
Here, I'll get your bio too so I can just read it out. It was okay until then?
Yes.
I'm Will Wilkinson, Vice President for Policy at the Niskanen Center, and today I'm talking to Jacob T. Levy. Jacob is the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory and Director of the Yan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds at McGill University. Jacob is the author of Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom, among other significant works, and he's an adjunct fellow at the Niskanen Center as well as a member of our advisory board. Thanks for coming on, Jacob.
Thank you very much for having me, Will.
Jacob, for those who might not know you, which would be outrageous if they don't know you, but can you just tell us a little bit about the kind of work you do at McGill and the kind of the themes of your work in political theory?
Sure. I work in both contemporary political theory and in the history of political thought. And in both areas, one of my main interests is pluralism and the way that social orders and social groupings constitute themselves without and under and sometimes against the centralizing state. My first book was on multiculturalism and on the protection of the rights of ethnic, cultural, religious, racial minorities. Rationalism, Pluralism, and Freedom, which you mentioned, is partly about the substantive protection of, say, freedom of association, of federalism, of the ability of cities to govern themselves, universities, churches to govern themselves, but also in the history of liberal thought and in the development of liberal politics, how much is owed to the debate between thinking that those intermediate groups are what protect us against central state power and protect our liberty, against others who worry that those kind of intermediate and local bodies can be sites of local tyranny and who want a more powerful, rational central state to protect us against the prejudice, against the conservatism, against the sometimes patriarchy or personalized dominance that can characterize them. I think that both of those are very important in the history of liberal thought. I think there's something true to both of them, though I am overwhelmingly more often a pluralist myself. That comes into play often in federalism in particular, which is a special area of research for me. The tension between thinking that we are freer when government is closer to home, when our provinces or our states or our cities are the primary sites of governance. There's some reason sometimes to think that. The states, the provinces, the cities, they can protect us when the central state gets too powerful. Mm-hmm. But it can also absolutely be the case that the local state government is, well, the site of Jim Crow or is the site of some very conservative patriarchal laws or is the site of personalized dominance by some local demagogue. And there's something attractive about a federalist system that isn't just local government, it's there being some ability of the state and the center or the province and the center to help balance each other out. So that kind of work brings me into empirical political science as well as normative political theory, as well as into constitutional law. And I have some background in both empirical political science and in law to try to think about when and under what rules an institution like federalism can serve as an effective balance that leaves us, roughly speaking, ahead of the game when it comes to the defense of freedom.
Awesome. We'll have to have a in-depth conversation sometime about your latest book, which is incredibly stimulating, and as someone who's not just a pluralist in the sense of, kind of being in favor of a society that has a lot of different people in it, has a lot of diversity, and has a lot of different centers of power. I'm also a pluralist about values, and they always come into conflict. This is kind of a Isaiah Berlin kind of view that I have, and I'm always very, very skeptical of views that like everything works out in a way that everything good is aligned. And what I really, really like about rationalism, pluralism, and freedom is that it has
none of that view in that book.
Yes, it has this sense that there are tragic trade-offs, that a kind of rationalist centralization protects liberty in one way, but threatens it in another, and that kind of pluralist federalism protects liberty in one way and threatens it in another, and that there is no recipe for balancing those things that ensures that people's freedom is protected. And I think you're just completely right, but it's, I think, something that's important for people to get through their heads.
Well, those are ideas that I've had a sense for a while that you and I had real overlap on, and I think that it's always a matter of local political judgment and context and circumstances. There's really no guarantee that we get it right. There's certainly no way to ensure that we're always getting it right. There's no formula that says, for example, here's exactly the right allocation of federal and state powers. That means we're never going to come out with our freedom disadvantaged by either. There's just trying as best we can to get a balance that works under particular circumstances.
Yeah. And if you care about freedom, or if you care about like liberal values, I mean, it at one level, when you start thinking about it, it just seems kind of obvious. It's just like, who has power at what level, right? So if more liberal people have power at a local level, and more illiberal people are in control of the central government, which is now true in the Trump administration, say like relative to the government of the state of California, right? Like it clearly seems that if you think, as I do, that the Trump administration is a threat to liberal values, and that's mostly what we're going to talk about today, then it's easy to see how a more liberal locality could be freedom preserving. But the opposite is also true, and that's like been the history of the United States, where the southern slave states enslaved people and then had a regime of racial apartheid and formal and informal terrorism against African Americans, and when they talked about liberty, they meant about the white population in the South meant their liberty to
dominate, domineer, and own and terrorize.
Yeah. And you might not like, in principle, the idea of the federal government swooping in and telling states that they can't govern themselves in the ways that they want to, but obviously that's a case where that was the only thing that was going to protect the freedom of African Americans in the South, and the Civil Rights Act, this is controversial among libertarians, but I don't think controversial between us.
No.
The Civil Rights Act was a huge gain in freedom, and represents a kind of imposition of this kind of rationalist central, sort of national government power on localities. But like obviously it can come out the other way, and so there's not a general principle that tells you what the what's going to be most freedom preserving.
And then to make it harder still, it can't be the right jurisdictional rule to say give jurisdiction to whichever level of government happens to be most liberal right now. You can't say we're going to let civil society wither until the day that the government is dangerous, and then suddenly we get civil society back. You can't say we let federalism wither until the day we need it and then suddenly get it back. In order to have the protections that pluralist institutions can provide, they're going to need to be ongoing in a way that sometimes they're going to be the agent in the wrong. And there has to be some ability to say, even if the local unit's getting things wrong, even if the local unit is genuinely acting unjustly, illiberally, it's better not to smash it. Mm-hmm. We need to be able to think that thought and at the same time think, sometimes you need to smash it. Sometimes what you're facing is apartheid and Jim Crow, and you need the Civil Rights Act and the force of the federal government sending in the National Guard and all the rest. And it's not just that that's a tight wire to walk. It's that I think there's genuinely no walking it in a completely consistent and certain way.
Yeah, agreed. And let's, I think we'll probably revisit this as we start talking about worries about the Trump administration. What I wanted to talk to you mostly about today is the blog posts that you've been writing for the Niskanen Center, starting at the end of November, not long after the election. Niskanen began a project devoted to the kind of restatement, revitalization, and defense of liberalism, and liberal values, and a liberal order. And Jacob helped launch that project with an essay that he wrote on post-truth politics. It was called Authoritarianism and Post-Truth Politics. I'll put the links to these posts in our show notes. And this essay is clearly, directly a response to an obvious feature about Donald Trump's personality, which is that he has no conscience when it comes to lying, dissembling, prevaricating. So he's fast and loose with the truth. And your essay was a really illuminating analysis of exactly why that's dangerous. Can you tell us what your worries are about Trump's particular brand of indifference to the truth?
So there was a particular worry that I wanted to emphasize in that essay that I didn't think had been much discussed in the couple of weeks of commentary on Trump as a liar after the election. There was a focus on his sheer indifference to truth and his uninterest in the question of whether what he was saying was believable. But something that struck me over and over again over the course of the campaign, and we've seen it happen sometimes since the election as well, is how much members of his inner circle, the core group of apologists over the course of the campaign — this was not only Kellyanne Conway, but people like Chris Christie and Rudy Giuliani, some of whom are now on the outs — were made to go out and repeat the lie in public. Falsehoods that are really clearly, easily demonstrable falsehoods. The most egregious example that I keep focusing on, though very far from the only one, is Trump's deliberate slippage from the truth that the murder rate rose faster over the last 2 years than at any point in the last 45 years. Mm-hmm. He's saying the murder rate is the highest that it's been in the last 45 years. Small changes from a small base make big percentage changes. What that means is when your murder rate is the lowest it's been in 2 generations, it doesn't take very many more murders to get a big double-digit increase year on year. Mm-hmm. But the murder rate is still very nearly the lowest it's been in 45 years. Trump said far too often in far too many rallies for it to have been a slip of the tongue. He clearly understood that he was taking a partial truth and turning it into an open lie. And then he sent people out to pretend that what he was saying was correct. when I saw that, and I thought about how he's treated his business associates, how he's treated the people who endorsed him in the campaign. Chris Christie was by far the most notorious example over the last year. It started to look to me like this was part of a pattern of his personality of dominance. Mm-hmm. He craves for people to have a very personalized kind of subservience to him. And an important feature of politics in authoritarian societies over the 20th century turned out to be the way in which being made to repeat the official lie compromised people. This is something that most movingly Václav Havel talked about in Power of the Powerless and other essays about the kind of untruth that people lived with under communism. When you parrot the official lie, you know that you're compromised. You parrot the official lie to get by because you're being made to lie by figures who are more powerful than you are. But your ability to say no the next time has been diminished. Trump, it seems to me, likes taking people who might have some independent authority, some ability to stand on their own, and making sure they don't have that anymore, reducing them to a kind of personalized subservience to him.
Yeah. And you compare that to the way, like, if you join the mafia, they're going to make you kill somebody. If you join a gang, you might have to do something horribly wrong. And having done something horribly wrong, they can count on your loyalty because you've compromised yourself.
You've sacrificed an important part of yourself. It can also be, now we have evidence on you, and now I can turn on you. But I think the more important part is you've compromised a part of yourself. Mm-hmm. And so the day comes when you think a line's been crossed, and you no longer feel like you have the moral authority to stand up to the wrongdoer in charge. One of the clearest kinds of examples that I think of in a more mundane part of ordinary life than the mafia is just the way that bullies act among children. Mm-hmm. A bully in chief, as it were, will bully one kid into attacking a third. There's something attractive about turning weaker kids against each other, and then the deputy bully has lost their moral authority. They know it. It's not even necessarily that the bully in chief says, I'll tell on you. It's, you know that you can't pretend you're better than me anymore.
Yeah, the bully has brought the deputy bully down to his level, and then the deputy bully then has an incentive to kind of act like the,
that's right.
Bully Prime did, and kind of turn other people, and it kind of creates a cascade effect.
They have a stake in the whole dominance system.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this isn't Trump's only tool for personalized humiliation. What we saw happen to Mitt Romney over the course of the dance pretending that he was a viable candidate for Secretary of State, the insistence that he take back things that he'd said before, which was a way of saying, make sure that you've told the world your word is no good. Romney had said some very forceful things against Trump early in the campaign, and while he didn't fully comply with the demand to take them all back, to denounce himself, Giuliani, importantly, was a person who was out there saying Romney shouldn't be anywhere near consideration for Secretary of State unless he just says that everything he said in that speech was false.
Yeah. Romney didn't do it at all. He didn't take anything back.
He didn't take anything back, but he
just said, like, looking forward, so he kind of spoke in a prospective way that what he was saying couldn't possibly be sincere.
Right.
What he had said in the past was true, but he very, very markedly
he didn't take it. It's really
back what he said.
But even that compromise of sincerity, I think, counts for something. The Trump circle wasn't able to make Romney call himself a liar, but they were able to put him in a position where he, as you say, he had to be publicly, demonstrably insincere as part of what then looks like an unsuccessful groveling for a job that he was never going to get. And that weakens the opposition to Trump. Romney's someone who had some authority. He had some standing in the Republican Party still, and he'd retained some moral independence, some moral authority over the course of the whole campaign that he then lost some of, as far as I can see, over the course of that process.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I'm not positive that it's a job that he was never going to get. I mean, because I think the dynamic that you're naming here was very much at stake, and if Trump could have gotten Romney to abase himself and basically erase the truths that he told about Romney, that kind of act of submission, I think, might have been really, really satisfying to Trump, and he might have thought it was an indication of loyalty. Now, and I still don't, I don't know if Romney had demeaned himself in that way, whether it would have ingratiated him to Trump in a way sufficient to make him a real candidate for the job. But I kind of suspect Trump would consider it. I think he would have gotten a great deal of pleasure about turning somebody who seems so dignified and principled.
That's certainly right. Whether the pleasure would have led to any sense that he then owed Romney anything, that's the part. I mean, we can't possibly know this.
Yeah.
I think that I saw a report from some member of the inner circle of someone saying it was always going to be Tillerson, but it'd be very hard to get any confirmation on that. But Trump certainly could have relished the humiliation, and then even more so saying, by the way, you don't get anything. And I think what's interesting here... Christie has by now.
Yeah.
Christie spent a year debasing himself, 6 months debasing himself, and has nothing to show for it.
No. They cut him out of the transition, and that'll be interesting to hear what the whole story is there. That I want to go back to Romney for just a second, because I think there's something really interesting here about Trump's MO, is that I think so the most charitable interpretation of what Romney was doing, which I'm actually inclined towards, I think Mitt Romney is a rarely kind of public-spirited person.
I agree with that.
I think he's a person of real conscience, real moral integrity, who embodies a certain kind of ethos of public service. And the most charitable, interpretation of what he was doing was that he thought, he thinks, which he's clearly said, that Trump is a dangerous charlatan. And that if he were to serve as Secretary of State, he might be able to mitigate some of the damage that Trump would do, and that it was worth sacrificing a little bit of dignity.
That's right.
In an effort to put yourself in that position. And what I think is interesting about that, even on that interpretation, that charitable interpretation of what Romney was doing, in some way Trump still used it against him successfully. That he took a strength of Romney's, his public spiritedness, his unselfishness, his willingness to take a hit to his public reputation,
and made it look like a groveling for a job.
And made it look like for a groveling job, and made him take the hit to his reputation in a way that weakened him as a critic of Trump.
Yes.
And I just feel like that is really indicative of the way he works. That he used a guy's moral integrity against him, and that he will do that over and over if he has the opportunity.
That's right, and that's the kind of pattern that I thought that I was seeing. I still think that we see in the way Trump uses his lies. Some of his lies have a purpose in terms of fooling the voters. Some of them have a purpose in terms of falsely criticizing his opponents. Some of them seem just pointless. And yet he still wants other people to be implicated in them and other people to compromise themselves.
Yeah.
I don't...
That seems like the point of the pointless lies, doesn't it? Because he comes out, he has no interest in... I mean, things are just, what was the thing that I saw the other day? I mean, just completely random things that don't mean anything. That he's just making something up on the spot and it's false. But now that he said it, people in his camp are committed to defending him for it. And I feel like that, like if it has a function, that's the function. I think you're right that the whole point of it, it's not necessarily to mislead the public or to manipulate public opinion, but it is just he's constantly compromising the integrity of the people who are working for them. They constantly are made to repeat completely random and capricious lies that have no purpose. There's no strategic purpose. So they're not advancing any strategic aim of the Trump administration by repeating this lie other than covering for Trump. And the more they have to cover for him, the more they're just, the more they're compromised.
There's a minor one I remember from the campaign, but the minorness is part of the point. Faced with criticism for the possibility, we still don't know because we haven't seen the tax returns, but faced with criticism for the possibility of not having paid personal income tax for a long time because he was carrying forward a loss from the early 1990s, Trump claimed that he had a responsibility to minimize his income tax payments because he has to do right by the investors in his businesses.
Yeah.
The dispute was about his personal income tax. It was not about his corporations that do have minority shareholders toward whom he has a fiduciary duty. The claim was just nonsense. The number of people who could follow any of that is small. This was not something that was going to change any voters' minds about the big question, do we need to see Trump's taxes or not? It wasn't going to change anybody's mind about do we care that he maybe didn't pay personal income taxes for a long time. But on this minor, very clearly wrong legal claim, he sends out attorneys like Rudy Giuliani and insists that they repeat this inconsequential but clear lie. That's the way that I think Trump relates to people beneath him. And insofar as he now thinks that, 300 million people are beneath him, I think it demonstrates something that he does instinctively after a lifetime as being a very personalized boss, a very personalized head of local authority relationships, that he's bringing into the political sphere. And it worries me very profoundly. I think he has a good instinctive sense for a morally terrible tool of authoritarian politics, which is compromise the people beneath you. That makes them dependent on you. It makes them incapable of resisting you and saying no to you in the future. It also, of course, pollutes the public sphere in terms of our ability to discern truth from falsehood and know the facts of any given situation, because it puts more and more liars out there. It turns more of the people around him into liars and means that they're filling airtime with claims that are false.
Yeah, one of the things you say in that, and I think it was useful in your essay, you distinguish Trump's MO from a couple different notions or conceptions of looseness with the truth. So one of them is Harry Frankfurt's idea of bullshit. And another is this recently very popular idea of gaslighting. And maybe you can tell us what Frankfurt means by bullshit and what people mean by gaslighting. I think it's obviously true that Trump does both of those things, but that it's not necessarily his the best way to understand what he's up to.
Or there's more than one thing that he's up to. And
yes.
He is such a routine liar that the likelihood is there's more than one moral phenomenon going on. But
yes.
What Harry Frankfurt, who's a moral philosopher emeritus at Princeton, says on Bullshit, which is this very funny old philosophy essay that a few years ago got repackaged as a little book and became this surprise bestseller.
Yeah, and if you're a philosophy person, that that was just the weirdest thing, that this old philosophy paper became a bestseller. It's just like a...
Yeah, I know the book editor who had the good idea to package it that way, and it was one of the smartest things he's ever done as a publicizer of genuinely thoughtful intellectual work. But so Frankfurt says that the key feature of bullshit is the indifference to the truth value of what's being said and the general understanding of that indifference. So he says a bullshitter isn't a liar. A liar has some particular piece of information they're trying to conceal, or they're trying to actively cultivate a false belief in people. The bullshitter is the one who doesn't mind if the thing he says happens to be true, but he doesn't care about that either. He's making noise for the sake of making noise that sounds a certain way. A relatively harmless figure that we have in popular culture for this is the patter of the used car salesman.
Yeah.
We don't believe that the used car salesman is necessarily...
Like, I'm from Illinois, and they're like, oh, what part of Illinois? And you say, I'm from Moline. He's like, oh, I've got a cousin in Moline. Right? And like, he doesn't have a cousin in Moline, but it does, that's kind of that's bullshit more than a lie.
That's right. And in a sense, the listener doesn't really care and understands that there's an indifference to truth going on. You understand that you could have said, I'm from Alaska, and suddenly you would have had a cousin in Alaska. And the bullshit makes that transaction go a little bit more smoothly. Bullshit is not always a grave moral offense. But in politics, it's always a serious problem, and it is a pervasive feature of political discourse, Frankfurt says, that you have politicians on the campaign trail who are just going to say the thing that is convenient. And the voters understand that the thing that is convenient might or might not have any real relationship to truth. But that's an indifference, and the indifference is the characteristic thing. The kind of lying I was talking about a couple of minutes ago, the authoritarian bullying compromising of other people, that only works if the claim is false. Mm-hmm. Trump can't be indifferent to whether or not it's true that his personal income taxes were tied up in a fiduciary duty to minority shareholders. If it were true, then someone like Giuliani isn't compromising himself by going out and saying it. It's important that it be false. But the importance of the falsehood isn't that Trump wants people to believe the false thing. The importance of the falsehood is getting someone else to say it. So that's the kind of distinction I was trying to draw from bullshit, which had been, as I took it over the first couple of weeks after the election, probably the most widespread description in a kind of popular intellectual way of Trump's poor relationship to truth. Gaslighting is a strange thing. It's been a strange thing to see the way that there's been an upsurge in talking about gaslighting over the last several months. Once a generation or so, suddenly people really remember or vaguely remember the movie Gaslighting or the other movie Gaslighting, the play, and start to use this language. Gaslighting in those movies was a way of making someone doubt their sanity by shaping the world around them in a false way.
And so the term comes from, I think, in the movie and the play, it's just like back when they had gas-powered lights, you could turn the light, you turn the gas up or turn the gas down to make the light brighter or dimmer, right? And then by manipulating, like, it's basically you're kind of turning the light off when somebody thought it was like. What is the metaphor?
And then denying that anything has happened. The villain in the movie. Did
you turn the light down? And you're like, no, I didn't turn the light down, and then you start doubting your own senses.
That's right. It's a way of. It matters that the victim of gaslighting at least kind of believe the lies, because if they believe you that you didn't turn the light down, then they start to doubt themselves. Yeah. Whereas, I mean, that's different from bullshit. If you just saw me turn the light down, and I say, no, I didn't turn the light down, then I'm bullshitting and I can't be successfully gaslighting you because you're not going to doubt yourself.
Yeah.
Gaslighting does have use. It has a lot of use in descriptions of the way that abuse happens in, say, in domestic settings, the way in which an abuser can psychologically damage the victim of abuse. It has some plausible uses, I think, in political life, but not very many, because the level of strange uncertainty that it depends on. I'm pretty sure that the lights went down. And I believe you that you didn't turn them off, because why would you be lying to me? And therefore, the whole world starts to seem off kilter to me.
Yeah, so when Trump says that the 5th congressional district in Georgia is, like, what did he say it was?
It's burning, it's crime-ridden, it's a hellhole.
Yeah, he's not gaslighting the people who live in the 5th district of Georgia because they just know he's right. Like, they're not going to be like, maybe they're not like, maybe he's right. Maybe we do live in a hellhole.
That's right.
Right? Like, and so that's not how it works. He has to actually and
the people who just believe it, the people who just believe that lie, they're not being gaslit either because they don't have anything countervailing. They just say, "Oh, okay."
They never had any beliefs about downtown Atlanta, Georgia.
That's right. It's understandable that people start to feel like the world is off kilter after November 8th in particular, but all through the last year, I feel like the world is off kilter too. But feeling like the world is off kilter doesn't mean that the way that Trump is lying is gaslighting you into thinking that the world is off kilter. And so I think there's real limits to the use of that metaphor, and I wanted to try to pull people back from relying too much on that understanding.
Yeah, so like in the inaugural speech, when he says that he's going to put an end to the carnage, and here he's referring to the lies he's been telling about
the crime rate, about the state of what he
about the crime rate, right? Like we live at, like the truth is, this is, one of the most peaceful, least crime-ridden periods in, it is the least crime-ridden period in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
Like you and I, we're about the same age. We were born, at just before the big crime wave got started, and what our crime rates have reverted to is about to it was when we were born. And so for our entire lives, it's been worse than it is now. And he's, so like in the inaugural, he again repeats this kind of lie. That isn't gaslighting. But it's clearly meant, but this isn't the kind of lie that he's making his cronies repeat. He's really trying to deceive and manipulate part of the electorate in a way that is going to help justify
huge increases in police powers and suppression of civil liberties, increases in incarceration, just a generalized...
If we have a crisis of violence, we might need to deploy violence to put it down, right? And if you plan to deploy violence, you're going to want to tell people, you're going to want to deceive people into thinking that the conditions on the ground justify a kind of it's just self-defense, right? Like we're protecting people who've been made vulnerable. But so that is a kind of big lie that is just
a lie. It's a monstrous lie.
Propagandistic manipulation.
Lie. Yeah, that's right.
That's heartening to know that we're right, or this is what we're what he began.
Which part of that was heartening?
With. Yeah, and and so yesterday he updated we're recording this the day after the inauguration. It might take a little bit to get it online, but we're talking the day after the inauguration. So yesterday they updated the website. There are lies all over the website. All right, so just the description on his own bio page, the description
of this
of the nature of his electoral victory.
Yes,
is again intended to deceive in a way that plays into a perception of his mandate and legitimacy. And this is a kind of different aspect of our sort of what people talk about when they're talking about the post-truth political era. Clearly, he's just trying to conceal the truth of the matter, which is that his electoral victory, I forget, was what it ranked, but it was ranks like 40.
It was very low as a percentage of the Electoral College in the history of American elections.
Yeah, and I don't think there's ever been a bigger electoral popular gap. So Trump lost the popular vote by not quite 3 million votes.
Yes.
And what he's trying to do is kind of erase from consciousness that fact.
Right. And trying to take people's memory of their genuine surprise that he won. And this is the part that worries me about this set of stories that Trump is telling. It's true that it was very surprising that he won. It was very surprising, according to the most reliable reports, to Trump and Trump's inner circle. It wasn't the thing that was expected on the basis of available information. And then he won by more than one state. This wasn't, in the end, the 2000 election that turned on exactly one state having a very, very close vote. He tries to turn that memory that we have, that it was surprising, and then it was surprisingly bigger than we would have thought, into a claim that it was genuinely a big win.
Yes. When
it was very far from being a big win. It was a very large popular vote loss. It was, in the history of American Electoral College decisions, singularly unimpressive, not as unimpressive as George W. Bush in 2000, but singularly unimpressive Electoral College win. And in this sheer demanding way that he very often has, that it is important that everyone around him affirm how magnificent he is.
Yes.
I remember seeing these stories about...
So Kellyanne Conway is on the news talking about his historic electoral, his landslide victory.
Yes.
And so that is an example of his underlings being forced to repeat the propaganda that does have a strategic purpose in deceiving the public about what the facts about his election were.
That's right. So there's more than one purpose in that. There is the compromise of the subordinates. There is the attempt to claim an unearned popular legitimacy. I do think there's also just a very strange feature of the man's psyche. And I don't like psychoanalyzing anybody. I don't like psychoanalyzing people I've never met. But there were reports that when Trump used to appear on television shows over the course of the 80s and 90s as he was emerging as a strange kind of celebrity, you could make fun of anything about him, but he would always insist on being called a billionaire, not a millionaire. The one thing you weren't allowed to do was call him a millionaire.
Yeah, and that's why he sued Tim O'Brien, who the journalist who wrote a book about him, who is now a senior editor, I forget his exact position at Bloomberg. And he had this huge lawsuit because Tim O'Brien estimated that his net worth was something in the hundreds of millions.
That's right. And he has a real determination not to appear as anything other than the biggest at whatever it is he thinks he's doing at the time. And I do think some of the determination to claim a huge electoral victory has something in common with that strange compulsion on his part.
Yeah, this need for self-aggrandizement. Now, let me segue into the next piece I want to talk about. A good way to transition is to note one of the first troubling things his administration did was to revoke the Twitter privileges of the National Park Service because they retweeted a picture of relatively the
meager
the sparsely attended inauguration. And the pictures of the inauguration are, like a kind of a PR disaster in this sense for Trump. You can see all the empty stands along the parade route, and that comparison, the very charitable interpretation of that is that, the weather was bad. His supporters live a long way from D.C. But today, we see the Women's March in Washington, D.C. There are...
includes many people who live a long way from D.C. and made the trip.
Yes. I'm sure there are lots of people from the D.C. area there, and that helps fill out the crowd. But, yesterday I was seeing all day long, photographs on social media of entire commercial airliners full of women from all over the country flying to D.C. for this march. And these marches are going on in cities around the country. And we see that there is this giant population of mainly women, and that's another amazing thing about these protests. It's not all, not just women by any means, but they're called the Women's March. It's predominantly women, and these crowds are vastly larger than Trump's. Now, what I want to talk to you now is why it is that women in particular might be so upset about a Trump administration, and whether that counts as what people think of as identity politics. Your piece, "The Defense of Liberty Can't Do Without Identity Politics," created quite a stir, and so I want to talk a little bit about what you think identity politics are, and whether women in particular marching in order to just stand up for their status and rights counts as identity politics, and if so, is there anything wrong with that?
And certainly there's nothing wrong with it, and a great deal of the point of the piece was very compatible with what we're seeing as an outpouring of that kind of defensive status today. I'm glad to have that introduction to talking about it, because I think one of the things that I didn't do right in that essay was I didn't talk enough. I talked hardly at all about the particular set of questions around women's identity politics and feminist responses. There were debates that were going on at the time, particularly about Black Lives Matter and about political correctness on college campuses, and those were the things that were on my mind that I wrote about. But one of the very important kinds of identity politics that...
Well, let me take one step back and just help with the context, is that partly what you're responding to is what was a relatively common diagnosis of Trump's win was that it represented a backlash, a kind of popular backlash against political correctness and or identity politics, and that because insofar as Trump is worrying and his success is based on this backlash against identity politics, shouldn't we be warier of identity politics? And you're kind of responding to that idea.
That's right. There was a lot in Trump's campaign and a lot in the language of some of the people who surrounded him, to say nothing of the more extremists online, the alt-right, who declared that part of the point of the 2016 Trump campaign was to push back against political correctness, against the idea that there's now a tyranny of thought and culture in America where women and gays and lesbians and blacks and Hispanics and Muslims, where the risk of saying anything that offends any of those groups is considered so great that there is a real chilling effect on freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and there's a tyranny of the identity politics of all of those relatively disadvantaged groups, and the white majority in America was going to defend itself against that onslaught of political correctness by turning to, in effect, the most politically incorrect candidate available. I think that almost all parts of that are false.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what's false about it has to do with the way that so-called political correctness disputes get reported and who it is who consumes that reporting. A lot of the most extreme cases of political correctness, of suppression of speech or chilling of speech, or even just angry protest of speech, arise out of college campuses. And a lot of reporters are alumni of the kinds of colleges and universities where those things happen. They are interested in following the stories. Some of them were student journalists and have been following the stories since they were students. And there's demand among professional media consumers, as it were, to hear the latest outrage that is being committed by left-wing students. These days, there's also some demand for those stories on the part of conservative talk radio and Fox News. But it's still the case that it's a tiny, tiny share of the country that's interested in following the news about the latest campus politics.
It's useful. People don't. I mean, like, especially overly educated people like us. The percentage of people in the country, in the United States, that has a PhD is something around 3%. A master's degree or professional degree is somewhere between 10 and 15, and then a 4-year college degree is 25 to 30. But most people get they have a 4-year college degree, they're getting it from non-elite institutions.
Non-elite, non-residential, not getting it in just 4 years. They're working their way through a state university over the course of their 20s.
Yes. And so the kind of horrors of political correctness that are reported on with relish by some right-leaning outlets is the sort of thing that literally it's a fraction of 1% of the population ever encounters any of this. And so there's something very strange about treating it as if that's somehow indicative or symptomatic of some illiberal aspect of our
60 million
culture.
Voters have been sitting around waiting for a savior from the wickedness of kind of crazy 20-year-old student activists.
Yeah, and insofar as there's a backlash, sorry, I'm just giving you a little bit of my own. Insofar as there's a backlash against political correctness, it's not really that people in a post that I published this week, I note that the liberal-conservative divide is to a great extent an urban, non-urban divide, and the Clinton-Trump vote breaks very cleanly along the just very dense counties went for Clinton, very non-dense counties went for Trump, and voters in those non-dense counties, and part of what I'm interested in that post is that we are getting these increasingly sort of polarizing, internally homogeneous kind of moral cultures. But what that means, people are inside their bubbles. People in the red state, low density bubble aren't encountering political correctness of the kind that happens on campuses. There's nobody. No. I mean, so I live in a hyper liberal college town here in Iowa City, Iowa. But if I go to my hometown, Marshalltown, Iowa, which is about an hour and a half from here, nobody is going to tell me, or is going to look at me weird if I say Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
It's actually the other way around. They're like, why are you being politically correct? And the thing is, for them, political correctness is something they heard about on Fox News.
Yes.
Right? So it's not that they're encountering this social pressure that's policing their speech, like in any sort of daily basis. There is confusion about, and there is a broader language policing around, what are we supposed to say these days, African American or black, or like what am I supposed to call Bruce Jenner her now? Right. It's so confusing. But the thing is, like, if you're in Marshalltown, Iowa, and you just call Caitlyn Jenner Bruce and you refer to her as him, nobody is gonna say anything to you or look odd, like give you a sideways glance. Right, they're more likely to give you a sideways glance if you are conforming to politically correct protocol.
And the fact that they would call it politically correct shows that they don't understand a phrase like that to mean something like censorship, which is how it gets talked about in the elite journalistic reporting on it that we get from kind of center-left and mainstream liberal and libertarian and conservative commentary. They just understand politically correct to be the other side. It's a label that they've learned to hang on the other side in, broadly speaking, culture conflicts or cleavages about big questions about who we are. It's picking your team. It's not a way of talking about defending themselves against the thought police.
Well, sorry that I forced you to undergo a sort of digression, but let's talk a little bit about your essay. And so you you attack this idea that there's any reason to believe that the election was some sort of backlash against political correctness or identity politics. Walk us through why it's misguided to think that identity politics backlash is what delivered a Trump presidency.
So the essay has two parts, and the first of them is an argument about just what happened in the election. And I thought that was important to do because there was so much immediate post-election commentary from people who identified themselves as being opponents of Trump or who identified themselves as being old-line Democrats or center liberals who wanted someone to blame for what had happened. And the blame was going to fall on relatively unpopular minority groups, on gays and lesbians, on trans people, on blacks, and especially on black activists, especially around Black Lives Matter, and on feminists. And in order to say that, they were maintaining the fact that all of these minority groups have been making all these demands so frightened the white Christian heartland that the white Christian heartland lashed out in this uncontrollable way. It's a really unattractive and insulting thing to say in the first case. An exchange I've had a few times over the last year on social media was someone saying, people like me are going to vote for Trump because people like you say mean things about us, to which I would say, we never said anything as mean as that we thought that you would irrationally vote for a populist, nationalist, racist, misogynist authoritarian. We actually didn't think things that mean about you. To treat that part of the electorate as being so incapable of independent thought as to just randomly react in self-destructive ways, that's extremely condescending. And it's something that was being done by the people who said that they were protecting those people against the condescension of coastal identity politics. But that's not the core of the empirical argument. The core of the empirical argument is election behavior just didn't change very much between 2012 and 2016. It changed just barely enough. It did change just barely enough in just the places that were able to tilt states in the upper Midwest into the Republican column. But Trump actually didn't get meaningfully more of the vote than Romney did. He barely got more of the white vote than Romney did. there was not a sign of some huge upsurge in how white people were going to relate, or in how voters in general were going to relate to the parties. What this election was in behavioral terms was people voting their parties overwhelmingly, and, as often happens, people being less willing to vote for the incumbent party when the incumbent party is seeking a third term in a row. Yeah. So independent enthusiasm for an incumbent party tends to fall when it's seeking its third term, but partisans vote their parties. The fact that we see so little real change in the electoral map, I think, leads to very dangerous temptations about how to overinterpret the election.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to just mention that it's just kind of more obviously explanatory to attribute Trump's win to the relatively low turnout that Hillary Clinton got among Democratic voters, and that a not very motivated Democratic base, like if she had gotten the kind of turnout that Obama got in 2012, she would have won. But she didn't, and it's hard to attribute suppressed Democratic turnout to, in states where she really needed to turn out were African Americans in big cities.
That's right.
Like if she'd won Detroit by more, and or Philadelphia by more, she could have won those states.
And her failure to do so cannot possibly be because white voters were angry about identity politics.
Right. The black voters in Detroit and Philadelphia didn't stay home because they were annoyed by identity politics.
No. I do think it's important to note the word suppressed that you used there, and to say political scientists are going to be working for quite a while to understand how much of that vote differential in urban and African American turnout in those affected states had to do with post-2012 changes in either formal voting laws or informal enfranchisement access. While there is clearly some fall-off in enthusiasm when you're no longer voting for the first African-American president, there are institutional changes, too, particularly in the wake of the striking down of Voting Rights Act pre-clearance by the Supreme Court, that have to be taken into account when we say Hillary
in this election in Wisconsin, especially.
Yes. But no, your point.
I didn't mean suppressed in any way that the vote was intentionally suppressed. Although I think
no, but in
some sense it was,
and we want to keep that as part of our explanation here too. This wasn't just Hillary didn't excite people. It was, at least sometimes and in some relevant places, some of the voters who would have voted for Hillary faced obstacles in doing so.
Yeah. And this kind of goes to the general point that many factors were involved here. So you needed the combination of lower turnout because, say, one, less excitement because less excitement among African American voters because Hillary Clinton is not African American. Lower turnout among African voters in the critical cities because there was a concerted effort to make it harder for them to register to vote. Lower turnout because of the massive preponderance of anti-Hillary Clinton media that had something to do with the hacking of the Democratic National Committee. So there's a multiplicity of considerations.
You can point to in retrospect that plausibly moved 80,000 or so votes. That becomes a thing that you can say, that's why we got Donald Trump. What that creates the temptation to do is to pick up whatever the thing was that you cared about on November 7th, whatever your hobby horse was, and say, that's why we got Donald Trump. And there's some sense in which it might be true, because very many small things could have moved 80,000 votes. There was a particular fixation, however, on this idea that said, the reason why we got Donald Trump is because I, center-left person or libertarian person, have been telling you all along that political correctness was a terrible danger, and you didn't listen to me. And you scary people further to my left so scared the white normal people or the uneducated white people or something like that, that of course they lashed out at you. And therefore, this thing that happened off to my right is the fault of this thing that happened off to my left that I've been telling you about all these years. And that's a deeply unattractive thing to do. It's no more true than any of the other things that could have moved 80,000 votes. And there's some reason to think that it's less true. And one thing that I looked at the poll data over the course of the campaign in writing the essay, and it really jumped out that Trump's worst moments in the polls were the moments in which he was the most outrageously racist or sexist. This is over the course of 2016, over the course of the general campaign. It's slightly different in the primary. But in the summer and fall, the attack on the cons and the release of the video in which he's caught on tape bragging about committing sexual assault, and the Alicia Machado story, which partook of both racism and sexism.
And his attack on Judge Curiel. That's right. Those four are his lowest moments in polling over the year. That doesn't suggest that there was deep popular sympathy for the ways in which he was challenging conventions of talking about race and sex. It suggests a kind of repulsion from... and it also suggests that if one of these sort of identity politics issues
had hit a week before
with the right timing, yes, then you could attribute Hillary Clinton's win to a rejection of Trump's political incorrectness, right? That would be just the mirror image mistake.
That's right.
Now, why is it so? So you establish, I think, completely convincingly that identity politics backlash isn't what elected Trump. But then the more important issue is why it's important not to diminish identity politics, or to think that the cause of freedom in particular depends in some way in marginalizing identity politics. Why do we need it? Why is it important that that we not be skeptical and contemptuous of identity politics?
Violations of liberty and suppressions of freedom and generally kinds of political oppression, they don't fall evenly on the world. They are very nearly always either deliberately targeted or sometimes accidentally fall on some populations more than others. They disproportionately fall on less powerful populations rather than more powerful populations, since the more powerful populations are more likely to have a disproportionate voice in the politics and policymaking in the first place. People understand when they are being singled out on the basis of a group membership for restrictions and diminutions in their freedom. They then respond in a group-oriented way. Responding in a group-oriented way helps mobilize. It helps build energy. It makes people feel like something other than an anonymous one person out of 300 million standing up and kind of futilely saying, "Don't oppress me." That there's some group people can wrap their minds around and attach their emotions to that can stand up and say, "Don't oppress us." It's a vehicle for powerful, effective political voice. And the example that I talked about the most in the essay was Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
Over the course of the last several years, for the first time in our lifetimes, there's been really meaningful, large-scale political objection to, resistance to the carceral state, the drug war, and abuses of police power. Now, you and I have been running around libertarian circles for a long time, and we have ourselves and friends of ours have been sounding the alarm about the drug war, about over-incarceration, about police power for a long time. Mm-hmm. And the number of people who heard us, well, we could all fit into a good-sized cocktail party sometime.
That's all we care about is cocktail parties.
Oh, that's right. There was. Let's not talk about that exchange. That was unpleasant. No. It's true. There's a recurring joke about libertarians at cocktail parties in Washington. In order to make some progress on these questions, there has to be meaningful political support. There needs to be meaningful political action. And policy reports are valuable, and good, accurate reporting about what happens is invaluable. But there also need to be people involved. There need to be a large number of people who are making something a central political commitment, people who might be willing to vote on the basis of it, people who might be willing to generate candidates for office out of it. Why did we finally start to see some positive movement over the course of especially the second Obama administration? Not nearly enough, but there started to be some movement toward criminal justice reform, some movement toward reining in the worst of police abuses, some movement toward reducing criminal sentencing for drug offenses and toward pardoning drug offenders. It has a lot to do with the fact that after a number of very high-profile cases of police killing black people, that Black Lives Matter developed as a political movement. That political movement was a way of saying, we understand that there is something meaningfully racial and meaningfully racist about this constellation of policies. You could diagnose the way that the drug war is wrong without referring to race. Adults should have the right to ingest chemicals of their free choice. But in fact, the drug war was not a racially neutral phenomenon. It never was, with the most conspicuous example of the way in which it was racially non-neutral being the differential sentencing for powdered cocaine and for crack. That became a cause célèbre eventually. But it's always been true that drugs that were used by black people were disproportionately targeted, that even among drugs that were more frequently used by white people than by black people, it's black users and black sellers who were disproportionately targeted. It was true in the Nixon administration that part of the point of embarking on the drug war was to provide a way to start to check the upsurge in post-civil rights era black political power, a way to justify increased police presence over black populations. And African Americans in large numbers understood this. And when they were finally in a position to stand up in a collective way and say, we understand that police violence is not racially neutral. Police violence meaningfully is a racist institution. And that's going to provide us with the emotional energy, with the organizational energy, with the commitment to challenge it. That has to be what meaningful political opposition to state power looks like and comes from. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that I agree with every tactical decision or every goal put into a statement by any group that identified itself as being part of Black Lives Matter. But politics can't be like that. There has to.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, and I guess that's something that I've seen, mentioned in your work before about when you're fighting for justice and we are both a certain kind of libertarian. So if our conception of justice gives a certain priority to liberty, if you were fighting for justice, people aren't motivated by the abstract positive conception of justice. And actually our ability to come up with a credible positive conception of justice is really dependent on and reliant upon and kind of parasitic on our understanding of what injustice is. And so you should expect that progress toward greater justice is going to be rooted in a reaction against the experience of injustice. And those who are, most subject to the abuse of state power are going to be the people who are most motivated to fight for increases in liberty. And if you don't think it's an issue of freedom that the armed branches of the state disproportionately kill and incarcerate African American men, if you don't think that that's an issue of freedom, then you don't really care about freedom, right? Like if you don't care about the state killing people and putting them in cages, then you just don't care.
That's right.
Right? Now the people who are going to be most motivated to oppose a pattern of state behavior that literally kills people and puts them in cages are going to be the people who are being killed and put in cages.
Or their friends and their neighbors and their near kin. And
yes. But that in some sense, that's going to be identity politics because our politics are already identity politics. The politics that the state is exercising are not neutral with respect to identity, as you said at the beginning. And so it's to complain that about Black Lives Matter as an identity politics movement is basically to register a lack of complaint about the
underlying
identity politics. Yeah, the identity politics that the state is practicing in treating different citizens differently.
I strongly think that's right. It can come alongside a disclaimer. I, of course, oppose the drug war and I oppose over-incarceration. But insofar as meaningful political action to oppose those things is going to take a form that you then disdain, then I think your opposition fails to be politically meaningful. Yeah. And why identity politics is necessary at the defense of freedom is because groups that are targeted will provide the organizational core and the motivational core, and they will be the ones leading, putting themselves on the line, and they'll ask for people to join them, and ask people to join them while they are still retaining their identity claim. When gay and lesbian civil rights activists said, we want same-sex marriage and we want our straight friends to support us, they weren't then saying, well, what we want is philosophically appropriately neutral marriage law. They weren't going to take the fact that it was gay and lesbian marriages that were being denied out of visibility in order to get straight allies because, well, why would those straight allies join the identity politics? They were precisely saying, yes, this is us. We're being targeted. If you care about our freedom, then come join us and come stand by us. And the right thing for their straight family members and friends and fellow citizens to do was to go stand by them and support them. But that didn't mean demanding that they take away the identity politics part of what they were saying. They were being targeted on an identitarian basis. And they responded in a way that gave them political effectiveness on an identitarian basis, appealing to political principles that are higher than saying, well, we want what we want. But the political principles aren't the only thing doing work. There's also the understanding this is our lives, our marriages, our well-being, our status and dignity at stake. And then I think that's a good moment to talk about the Women's March.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes left, so let's end there.
So there's really something uniquely astonishing, I think, about Trump's record with respect to women. It's something that runs through his whole career, and it's not as though in his whole career he hasn't been racist to African Americans, certainly starting with his denunciation and demand for execution of the Central Park Five. He's been on public record in really fundamentally racist ways about blacks and crime. He's been racist toward American Indians in public ways that have run through his whole career as a casino operator because he doesn't like the competition. But the relationship to women is something special. He has gone through a career in which women are either interesting to him because he thinks that they're sexually appealing, or they're not interesting to him. This is a man who bought a beauty pageant, went on the Howard Stern show and said, the great thing about being the owner of the beauty pageant is I get to walk around in the dressing rooms while the contestants are changing. Which he then, on reports from the contestants, did, even when they were teenagers. When women aren't sexually appealing to him, that's how he knows how to insult them. This is the Alicia Machado story. This is the Rosie O'Donnell story. This is partly the Carly Fiorina and Hillary Clinton story. He likes talking about the looks of women he doesn't like. And what's wrong with them is that they don't look good. That we eventually, late in the campaign, ended up with the sexual assault charges and the recorded bragging about committing sexual assault. That, in a way, was just the horrifying but not deeply surprising conclusion to who Trump has been. He's got a very sexualized contempt of women and a real dislike of women whom he can't appropriately sexualize. Even horrifyingly, how he knows how to compliment his intelligent, accomplished daughter is, I'd date her. She's hot. I would date her. What kind of a person reacts that way to I think it is extremely understandable for women to say, or very many feminist women to say, Trump poses a distinct threat to.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing about Trump. It's so bad. You don't even need to be feminist.
No, you don't. You don't need to be a self-conscious.
It's so the objectification. Yes. The fact of the sexual assault, the record of the sexual assault, his pattern of objectification of women, and and the problem with the objectification is really the desubjectification, the hollowing out a person of their personhood, and reducing them to.
I try to avoid academic jargon in these things, Will, but apparently I should catch up.
Yeah, and there are many millions of American women who just feel. I mean, they can just feel in their soul the fact that this man does not recognize them as a human person on equal grounds, that he sees them as either a pleasant or unpleasant to look at set of external attributes, that's all they are, and it is just enraging.
Yeah.
And and so you can see why this guy becoming the president would, I think if you add them all up today, there are millions of women in the United States that went out to protest the fact that this man is the president of the United States of America.
Yes, and while some of that has to do with the disappointment in not having elected the first woman president, a great deal of it has to do with an understanding that there's a distinctive disregard for the humanity and the fellow citizenship on Trump's part in particular. I don't think that if Mitt Romney had been elected president in November 2016, that there would have been the demand for an immediate outpouring of women's affirmation, women's support for each other, and an understanding that it was important to say in public that something had happened that was deeply, deeply troubling to women's status as women in the United States.
Yeah. Well, and you can see it with the symbolism of the marches, like the pussy hats, right? The many women are wearing these sort of knit pink hats that have been, that look kind of like they've got ears on them, that are sort of known. And they are not about to forget the grab 'em by the pussy, bragging about sexual assault video, and they're gonna keep it alive. And yeah, this is identity politics, right? Like, it's about women as women protecting their entitlement to the full slate of rights and liberties that our institutions are supposed to afford everyone. Because they can see that this guy doesn't consider them as equals, and thinks that he can abuse them with impunity, and thinks that that's okay.
Yes, and he unfortunately seems to have shown that there's a kind of impunity. It's important then to say it's not okay. It's important to emphasize that for the rest of the American polity and the rest of the American culture, that the fact that Trump has led the life that he's led and was seemingly rewarded for it at the end can't be allowed to be taken as evidence for the proposition, yes, this is now how American public life understands the status and the appropriate role of women.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, Jacob. Thanks for a terrific discussion. We didn't get to your piece on parties, but perhaps we can take it up next time, bundle it together with a discussion of the next couple essays that you do for us in Niskanen. Thanks for coming.
I'll look forward to it. Thank you for having me.
All right, thanks so much.
Bye.
Talk to you soon. All right, thanks, Jacob.
Does that work?
That's great. That was great. I think that was a really good conversation. People will like it. As usual with these things, I let each segment go longer than I want them to because I find it interesting. So I'll probably develop a little more discipline as I do this. But thanks. I think this is a great first chat, and we definitely will do it again. I'm going to try to see if I can get it out maybe Wednesday or Thursday of this week. It involves a little bit of, you have to do stuff registering a new podcast with iTunes and stuff like that. And I'll put a little intro on, a little music maybe, and I think a bunch of people will listen to it. So that's
all right. Well, thank you for all of your good work.
All right, thank you too. Yeah, and we should just have a chat on the phone sometime soon, just to catch up on kind of what's.
Yeah, that would be good.
So. Yeah, let's do that. I would do it now, except I've got to go relieve Harry of
I've got to move on too. Okay, but sometime soon. Bye.
All right, have a good rest of your weekend, man.